Hello, and thanks for tuning in to Circling Dialogos and my conversation with Christopher Mastropietro. Initially, Christopher and I wanted to get together and just record like a short 5 to 10 minute video, basically announcing our next Circling into Dialogos workshop, which is October 21st and 22nd on Zoom with John Vervaeke and ourselves from 7 a.m. to 1 p.m. So that's 7 a.m., 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And of course, what ended up happening was we ended up really diving into the question, why practice at all? Right? Why do the course, and why have spiritual practices? Why have philosophical practices? Why engage at that level? At what level of ourselves does that operate on, and why bother doing that? And so it ended up being quite an hour-long exploration of kind of going deep into that, or at least a very deep part of it. And what I appreciated in this dialogue was this exploration about, looking at the human being, as following Heidegger here, as a world disclosure, right? In other words, what kind of world do you as a human being disclose? And that the possibility that spiritual practices operate at the level that, in all the machinery in ourselves, that we exercise and express in disclosing the world, in opening it up in a particular way, and the kinds of conversations that we'll find ourselves spontaneously getting into and drawing out in other people, and circumstances and situations, and the kind of worlds that get disclosed through what is exercised in dialectic into dialogos. So conversation goes quite deep. Always a privilege to talk with Christopher about all of this stuff. And I hope you really enjoy the conversation. Again, the course is October 21st and 22nd. That's Saturday and Sunday. It's 7 a.m. to 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And that's taught with John Vervaeke, Christopher, and myself. All the details and the relevant links, are below. Thank you so much. Enjoy the conversation.
So, the weekend workshop, the Wisdom Intensive, Circling Dialogos. I think the thing about it that is in some ways most valuable is that it's a kind of condensation of all kinds of different things that each have their long form practice. And it's an exposure to a whole cluster of different practices in a very short span of time that not only allows for the practices themselves, but also introduces them and introduces the possibility of doing each of them in their own arena.
Yeah.
Right. So the meditation and the Neoplatonic contemplation are good examples of that, right? There are long form meditation courses. Obviously, there's the series that John has on his channel, but obviously with the Vervaeke Foundation, there are meditation classes offered by Rick Repetti. So there's a long form, more sustained way of doing that. And obviously with the circling exercises that lead into the dialectic, there's Art of Circling that you do at the Circling Institute. And that would be just a taste, just a kind of an exposure to just some of the rudiments of that invite a more thorough experience if folks choose to do that. And there's Philosophical Fellowship, which sort of takes the relational elements of the circling exercise and the contemplative elements of the Neoplatonic exercise and put them into dialogue with a text and a tradition that begins to give them a grounding in ideas. And what do we do with ideas when we situate them in this different kind of context, right? The more non-propositional context. And that's a practice that a lot of people, I at least so I hear, find really interesting and valuable, obviously hearkening back to the Lectio Divina that is largely absent from the way that we typically read and encounter texts.
Mhm.
And then, of course, the dialectic and the dialogos itself, which envelops all of those different elements and is greater than the sum of those elements in some ways.
Mhm.
And the thing I really love about the weekend is that it's almost a tease because of how fast it goes
Yeah.
and how condensed it is. But the thing I really love about it, it's like a rapid survey into a variety of other things. But at the same time, it also comprises a whole experience unto itself.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's both of those things at once. And I think the thing that's really valuable about it is that it can be both at once. It is both a survey of things that you can undertake in long form, and it also creates its own kind of experience that is very singular and that you would not find doing any of those other exercises in a long form format, right? You're never going to get all of these things in one place,
Yeah.
except for on this weekend. And I think it's the all-in-one placeness,
Yeah.
I put it that way,
Yeah.
that makes a particular kind of whole.
Yeah.
And I don't think that there is a version of that whole that we do anywhere else, even though we develop and drop down each of those things in other places.
Right. Right. Totally. Yeah. And I, I would say probably with each one of the ecology of practices that are layers. So the way the course works is just like all the things you referenced are there's, meditation, there's contemplation, there's circling. These are all like domains, right, of practice essentially. Together form an ecology, a whole gestalt, a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that with each one of them, at some, yeah, I would say with each one of them, all of them, when realized, right, the realization is getting present to or becoming present to what you're related with as being related to it for its own sake. Like it's this this element of where, because I think most of the time with most people, right, what we're doing is we're related to what we're related to because it's getting us to somewhere else, right? It's
Mm.
it's rare to be relating to what I'm relating to, doing what I'm doing for its own sake, right? It's like where the, like what I'm sacrificing, what I'm giving into it, what I'm speaking into it, what I'm doing, right, is in some sense, it's not for anything else other than what's present right here. Mm-hmm. That remembering of that there is a way and there is something about being alive and being present and being in this moment right here, that there's a way where the whole thing is available, right? And so each one of these practices are practices in some level of remembering that, right? Of remembering to that at some deep level, like the meaning that courses through the entire universe, right, is at some sense is right there, and that it is remarkably difficult to remember that, but probably when it comes down to it, it is the very thing that's worth it taking everything to remember that.
Right.
And so in some sense, this course is a deepening into remembering that, like, actually what I'm in front of right now contains the whole thing, and that's worth it. Like, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do like I wouldn't do anything else, right? Like, this is the ultimate sense of things, and developing that sense, or that scent, is what I think that I would say can set a precedence, right? For when you're, like, after you take this course, right? There is a sense where you can kind of, well, one, you have a precedence that conversations can go in directions that are surprisingly profound, right? And that there's ways that I can show up, right, that can really influence and impact that, right? There's ways to adjust my attention and the way I'm perceiving, right, that afford the same thing. And that like, to have that experience sets a horizon for something being possible, right? That you can kind of get a sense, and as you go through your life after that, right, you can got to get a sense of and you can develop that sense of how to bring this into more of your relationships, into more of your activity in your practices. I think essentially, like, this is, especially like with the dialectic and the dialogos, the particular Western ethos, right? That the core of that philosophical, mystical, right? Platonic, Neoplatonic sense of revealing the universe that way. This course is really about the essence of that particular way of turning one's attention.
Mm. Mm. I really like this framing of it as one long exercise in remembering. I don't think I had thought of it that way before, but the sort of image I get as you describe that is that the additive effect of all of these exercises put together in this structure is really the effect of removal. It's a certain kind of removal, that something is actually being removed with each exercise, and whatever it is that's being removed has something to do with the variety of things that distract us from the act of remembering what was prior to the things that are on our mind in this moment. It's the exercises are in some ways a process of emptying.
Yeah.
And I know for me, when I enter into this practice or this process, usually there's a background noise of all kinds of concerns and preoccupations and whatever's buzzing around that day, and that walking through the form of the practice, at the other end, there is a certain kind of silence and stillness that becomes available that wasn't available prior to starting the practice. And I often feel that something has been lifted off, something obfuscating. And it's not right. It's not anything I could express, as we take so many pains to say. It's not propositional. It's not like I have this great insight about the nature of reality. I mean, maybe that happens, but it will just as soon fade away. It's not really the point. What I'm left with, though, is I'm left with a clearer axis, a clearer line of relation to the sense of silence and stillness that precedes all of the nattering distractions that I might have walked in with. And that the whole structure is a way of dropping down into that. And what that provides is a kind of openness to being able to reconsider things and resituate myself or oneself in the face of any given problem or situation. And that, to me, is, I'm hearing that in what you're describing, as I'm hearing the emptying out, the removal, the effective removal, as much as we walk through all kinds of things and people have to learn new techniques and try new things on. I think that the cumulative effect of that is being able to actually relieve something.
Yeah, totally. Totally. And that, well, I experienced this last weekend where I went back to where I had lived for a number of years in the Bay Area and went to a party and went outside, and I was getting ready to leave the party, and I just sat down for a moment, and then I sat next to somebody, and we just started to chit chat a little bit. And we probably talked for about, I don't know, we ended up talking for about 45 minutes. But what what ended up happening in that conversation, right, was I got to actually find out that had just, she was about 3 or 4 months on the other side of both of her parents dying essentially of old age in hospice together on the same day.
Wow.
Um, and the whole ride of the difficulty, right, and what it took to really be there for the parents in that way, and the mountains of logistical stuff. It's like if you've experienced death, one of the things that you'll notice is like there's so many logistics involved when someone dies, right? Like there's so many things and phone calls to make and insurance companies and all this kind of stuff. And she just basically shared with me that the whole ride of what it was like to be able to sit in front of both of her parents, right? They were like, it was like 9 hours apart from when they died, of to be able to be at that moment of from life to death, and that very moment, everything that it took to be there in that way. And I think we were both present to out of that conversation. I was present to this sense of that there were so many there were so many things that she talked about that were just intrinsically difficult and unpleasant to experience. However, I was so present to that for the sake of being there in that moment with the people that gave birth to you and what that meant for them and what that took, the meaningfulness of that was just pouring out of her and pouring out of me, right, in that same sense. And I'm having, my mom's going through she's going through some she's getting older and having health conditions and stuff like this. So there's also another level where I was kind of got to experience my own, like myself in relationship to this and what that would all look like. But I was like, at some level, I think that see, that conversation could have not happened, right? It could have not happened, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It didn't happen. In fact, it was most likely that it wasn't going to happen. However, I would say that it happened, at least my part of that, was because on some level I could sense that there was something really deep there that I could feel. I didn't know what it was, but that I would say that being able to smell meaning, right, being able to sense significance, to be able to to cultivate our sense of wonder for being, that is something that is a 24-hour a day, 7 day a week possibility, right? All the years of doing these kinds of practices and opening up to this inquiry that I think is really culminated in everything that happens into circling into dialogos, is like in some level it's that having that orientation and the skills to be able to meet that moment such that it's something like her experience of her parents' death and her own like identity transformation as a consequence of it, right? And the implications of that and the beauty and the whole universe that came out of that we both got to feel and cry together about, right? We never met each other, right? Like that there's something about like my part of that was was there something cultivated in me that made that moment more likely than not?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, I would say is one of the, I would say is if you want to dive in and do this course, that's probably one of the main reasons that you want to do it. Right.
To make a moment such as the one you had,
Mm-hmm.
where there's something that needs to come out, there's something that actually needs to be brought up to the fore,
Yeah.
something that was in the background that actually needs to come into the foreground, something that's dying to be known and be said, to be midwifed, we would say.
Yeah.
And we can't do these things by ourselves often. We can do some of it.
Yeah.
A lot of it we can't do.
Yeah.
We need to walk into a place, into a little world, even if that world vanishes when we leave it, like Narnia, you know.
Yeah.
We need to walk into a world that is created for the purpose of having something spoken
Mm-hmm.
that otherwise wouldn't be, so that something that needs to come forth can.
Yeah.
So we have it for ourselves to take back and to pour it into wherever it belongs. And it's often not clear what it is that needs to come out, what it is that needs to be known until the moment it is. But I have that experience too that you've described, which is an encounter or a conversation or a confrontation I didn't seek or I didn't know to seek, but that occurred. And I can't imagine afterwards it not having had occurred.
Yeah. Right. Right.
And I suppose this is just a slightly more formal way of inviting the thing that needs to occur that isn't
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that isn't clearly paved out in front of us yet.
Yes, exactly.
And
And
in some way, even though the practices are collective and have a relate, you know, an orientation to relate, there's also something for the individual that is very much, I hope, in the framing,
yeah.
which is that, you know, I cannot tell you what it is that you should be getting out of this, but that there is some kind of meaningful confrontation with other people and with oneself that often comes of it, and comes of it reliably enough to think, well, there's something to this, you know, there's something to this. And whatever it is that an individual, whatever it is that any one person finds, is theirs to find.
Yes, absolutely. On that striking thing about, because so one of the things that each one of these practices in their own way, um, I think what's surprising for a lot of people is what's not as surprising is the proactive place, the generative skills, and the things that you can learn how to say, and like the ways that you can bring your attention and bring to bear yourself in a situation, right? The thing that's, I think, really surprising for a lot of people is actually how profound the experience of being someone that calls forth the world to reveal itself, right? Is in that midwife Socratic sense, the Socratic sense of it, right? Is really powerful, I think, in what Socrates is really talking about. What I think philosophical questioning is really talking about is this because we oftentimes think of sovereignty and agency as being these things that are like a you know an active affecting, right? A proactive affecting, which they are. But there's also an element of it, right, that touches into a deeper transjective relationship that connects us and the world in the first place, which is, I would say, these deep levels of listening and ways of paying attention. That's something like, if I'm, for example, if I'm wine, right? If I'm wine, right? Like we'll say the world is wine, right? Like if I'm wine, who do I want to be drunk by? Right? Do I, in some sense, I think that's a real thing. It's a real thing with human beings. Like
Yeah.
in a very real way, like um we are
Tasted by. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
we are that place, or one of the ways that all that is is tasting itself, is knowing itself, right? And 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 I think that dialectic in the dialogos is very much keyed in onto that element that's really difficult to talk about and to highlight, but I think it's probably more fundamental to what it is to be human than almost anything else.
Mm. Oh, that's good, guy. Another, I suppose another analogy occurred to me when you made that move. If I were wine, who would I want to be drunk by? And this seems to be to be in a similar spirit, which is the question of if I'm this sounds very abstruse and esoteric, but I don't even mean it to be. It's like if I am if me as an ego, if me as a figment of consciousness in the present moment is a dream, is a figment of a dream or a character of a dream, right? Something that is produced in response to a specific context in a certain arena at this moment in time, framed by all of the things that go into one moment, as happens at the beginning of a dialectic when I make my first proposal. If that me that enters into that arena is a figment of me, it is a character that is created in that moment of time and performed by the process itself as the figment of a dream. Who is it that I am dreamed by?
Mm.
Right.
Mm.
Right.
Mm.
Who is the dreamer
Yeah,
of whose dream I am
yeah,
when I make my first proposal?
yeah, totally.
And that the process of the dialectic is in some ways gathering the memory that refers itself over back to the dreamer.
Say that last part again. The process of the
The
dialect.
dialectic is the gathering together, the anamnesis, the gathering together of the memory
Mm.
of the dreamer,
Yes, yes,
the logos.
yes. The logos. Right, right.
Now that sounds awfully like, it's just a way of feeling out the sensibility that
Mm.
that I find in it. Whether whether that means anything to anyone is besides the point. But to me, there's somehow I find that in
Yeah,
it.
yeah. I mean, what I'm really liking, well, one is like as you're saying it, I'm just sinking into it. It's very easy to sink into because it's like there there is, and I've heard you talk about this in different ways, but when you get really present to something or to being, right, to existence, to, well, anything really, like there's this element that something shines forth, right? It shines forth. It's knowable at some level. I can understand it. I can make propositions about it. I can see it. I can maybe even measure it or whatever. But then there's it. If you're really at touch with it, in the full sense of the way. Like if really it's gathering, it's also gathering this really clear sense of mystery that withdraws,
Mm.
like a not a mystery, not like a mystery in something like the missing of information, but like the way that uh, sugar is sugar cube, like a sugar cube is sugar all the way through,
Mm.
right? There's a sense to know something and to know the world and the things that matter in our lives at that level is to really know it. Its substance in some way is this kind of inexhaustible mystery. And when that's for me, when that's really there, it it's kind of what it's that's the thing that ends up shining through, right? It's the beauty in some sense that really goes that calls out of a person, out of a moment, right? Out of a conversation that I was like the one I was talking about. That sense of like you know, deepening and cultivating our desire for that, right? In some sense, it's like I can't think of anything more important,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like cultivating that very very rich sense of that. Yeah, uh there is something really ineffable, for example, with a person. It's one of the things with the thing that I keep one keeps seeing over and over and over again in circling in some way is that a person, you know, is something is it's like I will never be able to sum Chris up in some final way. In fact, you can't even sum you up in some final way.
Probably least of all, we're probably least capable of doing it uh, with ourselves, of
Oh,
ourselves.
totally. That there's a way that you animate, you shine forth, right? In very particular ways that I can appreciate. And there's something that withdraws, right?
Mm-hmm.
I can't ever, and that sweet spot between those two, I think you and John, one of the names you used is like this place of the suchness and the moreness,
Mm-hmm.
right? That I would say like that kind of feeling into perceptually, emotionally, um, uh, in an embodied way, in a psychological way, in all these dimensions in which we can start to like kind of feel into that sweet spot, right? And continually cultivate our desire for that. Um, and the more we cultivate that desire, I think we become more something like an attractor basin.
Mm-hmm.
Really cool conversations end up coming our way that we couldn't have anticipated.
I think you're right.
Our way of responding to the world, right?
I That's such a good point, and I think that there's an attention to patterns. I have noticed that, I've noticed that there's a certain depth of attention to certain patterns that is somehow available to me now, without overstating it, but there's a
Mm,
tuning, the hearkening attunement, as
yeah,
it's the Heraclitan idea, right? There's a hearkening attunement that you're listening for things, you're learning to listen for something that is not said, that cannot be said. You're listening for the inexpressible, that hidden harmony
yeah.
that he described in his fragments or stated in his fragments, that you learn to listen for something that can't isn't linguistic, it's not propositional, it's not anything that you could state, but there's a kind of receptivity that's being trained. There's a willingness, there's an openness to see things that maybe weren't obvious before. And sometimes the things that become visible, having been invisible, are little touches of the uncanny, you know, the things that I might call synchronicities,
Yeah.
which, and boy, when they start coming up, and I think it's best to have just sort of an open and sort of receptive posture to them. There's no need to seize on them or to over theorize about them necessarily, not for this purpose. It's just interesting to see the things that start to stitch themselves together.
Mm,
And that's not any kind of metaphysical statement about the nature of the world or reality, but it is a statement about the meaningfulness of the way that the world appears phenomenologically.
Yeah.
And that's enough.
Yeah.
At least, I think at least for me, it's enough, provided that it's not overlaid with, too much of a hunger for certitude about certain things. And I do find in these practices, especially when they all come together, that they form a certain structure. You can think of the structure in many different ways. There's a way in which you can think of it as a narrative structure that has a horizontal dimension. And of course, there's a vertical structure too, which is a gradual exceeding of perspective.
Mm.
And even if it's just practiced in miniature in the span of a day or a weekend, there's a way in which the pattern can be internalized. I think that's probably also the benefit of just the repetition. The repetition of that pattern internalizes it and just creates a little kind of internalized or introjected, perhaps a psychotechnology. I forgive the $5 word, but really I just mean like there's a way in which the pattern can become a little introjected entity, like a tool, something that can help to spring and lever inside and provoke other things into awareness. And that happens not forcibly, not by any strain of concentration or any intention even. It's just something that just happens, like getting into a relationship with somebody. You just find that the relationship takes on a life in your psyche and becomes an entity, and it becomes part of what fertilizes your attention and directs it.
One of the things that you said that struck me was I want to draw it out a little bit more. When you talked about the uncanniness, right? The synchronicities and the uncanniness. Mm-hmm. And you said that is stitching itself together, right? And you made this distinction between it's not like it's the metaphysical truth of reality, but it's the phenomenological one, right? And I think what struck me about that is that this, like, what you mean, like, I want to know what you mean by uncanny. This is really interesting. That's really interesting word. And this sense of stitching, this sense of that there's a phenomenological stitching, right, going on. And why so much?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think by uncanny, I mean the non-logical identity of symbol. How two things that are of very, let's say, different material realities can align themselves in such a way that they form a pattern that has unmistakable resonance in my consciousness, in the way that my consciousness makes sense of them.
Yeah.
I think of a classic Jungian synchronicity as a good example of that, right? I think about somebody and then who I haven't seen in 2 years and they call. Or, there is something that I'm wrestling with and seeking, and I chance upon someone who is uniquely situated to draw it out and help me give it texture. It sounds like something like that happened in your conversation you've described. Or I just notice that there are certain motifs in my environment that are helping to draw out a presence of mind and help me to order it and frame it, and that there's a way that things are correlating that I can't quite trace to any causal structure.
Yeah.
And I can't, or at least have no desire to draw metaphysical inferences about what exactly that amounts to, except insofar as it has an intuitive meaningfulness that exceeds any expectation I could have had about it. Meaning these things occur.
Intuitive meaningfulness that exceeds any expectation I could have had about it.
Which basically means I wasn't looking for it.
Yeah.
I wasn't anticipating it. I wasn't seeking it out. I wasn't contriving it. Now, then the question becomes, which is very, 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 very tricky question. It becomes an ontological question, which is, okay, these patterns are, it's the top down, bottom up question, right? Well, these patterns are creating themselves, and I'm seeing patterns in my life and my relationships and in the way that things that seemingly have nothing to do with one another and no explicit contact with one another in different domains of life have this converge and gather together into some kind of meaningful formation, into an arrowhead that directs my attention to something. And then the question becomes, and that's the stitching that I mentioned to your second question. And then, well, then I might ask, well, am I discovering something or am I creating something?
Am I discovering something or am I creating something?
Right. Well, and then that question is a big question, and I'm happy to let it hang. But then the next thought I have is, well, what's the difference? Right? And I think of a word like inventio, which is exactly the combination thereof. It is the recollection in the Platonic sense that is the creation that is also the discovery.
Yeah.
It is the movement backward and forward simultaneously. It is the repetition of something that was before and may yet still be. And that the gathering together of a meaningful pattern, a la the logos, or what we mean by logos, often presents to me as being something that is both novel and also already known. Right? Something being midwifed. It's coming into the world anew, but it's coming from a place where it already was. It's just coming into consciousness, and then that to me, that's implicit in the tradition of the word logos, right? It is the word that is the creative word. It's the unfolding of creation into consciousness. This is already getting more this is already getting more abstruse than I intended it to be. But that, I guess, is what I mean by uncanny, in that I find myself having a hand in realizing a pattern. And by my realizing it, it becomes deeply real to me. It's made real by the fact of my noticing it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I have no way if I'm noticing something that was already before my noticing it, or if noticing it is actually the act of creating it.
Yeah.
But ultimately, phenomenologically, I can't distinguish those two things. It simply becomes in my awareness of it, and it becomes a meaningful pattern that has something to do with what is real at the bottom of life.
Yes.
And I do find, and it's hard to causally attribute these things, so all due caution implied, but I'm just relaying an experience. I find that these kinds of practices, which are trying to sensitize me to the mystery, to that space of learned ignorance we keep drumming, have something to do with tuning the attention to those uncanny moments of creating or realizing meaningful patterns that bring domains of life that do not relate to one another together into symbolic resonance, non-logical identity.
Yeah. Yes.
Taking the parts and gathering them toward a whole, not a final whole, not anything that's finished, but in their movement to that whole, coming into unity.
Yes. One of the things I'm hearing in this is implied is this, what I'm hearing is like a way of participating. Like, in some sense, you're also talking about the process of, I guess, remembering, right? There's that thing when you said, yeah, I couldn't have had expectations for this. However, when it happened, I realized like I was really wanting this, or I was already had a hunch about it, but didn't even realize until it. That happens to me all the time. That just that sense of just, oh, I had no idea that I was been looking for that my whole life. Like, that
Mm-hmm.
that sense that yeah, that's kind of, yeah, this uncanny sense to it. And I think that, would you say, Christopher, that to recognize and uh, to recognize this stitching, right, and to be continually sufficiently confused about, am I the stitcher or am I the one being stitched? Um,
Yes.
and the orientation such that that kind of that sense of being continually surprised, right, to being surprised by life and being open to that way of realizing what's a deeper sense of gathering that's been happening, and that through line, that uncanny through line, and recognizing that and according to that and noticing that. Is that something that can be cultivated? Is that something that can be cultivated? And like, how has that been cultivated for you, or how have you seen it with other people? What are the consequences of that, of
Mm.
such uncanny cultivation?
Yeah, uncanny cultivation of the uncanny.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I suspect so, and I hope so.
Mm-hmm.
And and but I think it only happens with great assistance from other people who are willing to wonder at the possibility, even if the wondering about it is really only playful or even ironic.
Yeah.
But it's the seeking of it. It's living in the question, living with the question. Like, live with a question long enough, and if it's the right question, it will pry something open.
And so what
It's
you're saying, it's like living in the question, but finding yourself living in the question with other people living
Yes,
in the question.
yes, yes.
So
I,
fellowship
I
seems
think so.
key to being able to, if all of this is, you can cultivate it, if it is, it comes, as you say, with great assistance.
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
I think so. And I think there are personal dimensions, solitary dimensions to it too. Um, I think there are both. I think there has to be both. I
Yeah.
think that there's a dialectic between those, right? We talk about the dialectic in the context of a practice, but there's also a dialectic between the collective and the individual, the participation and individuation, right? As we might say after Tillich.
Yeah.
Those two dimensions of it, I think, are necessary, and I think they cross into a relationship with one another,
Yeah.
right? Like, my inwardness is populated with the voices of those whose introjected characters help me to flesh things out, even when they're not present to me.
Mhm.
But the spaciousness of solitary contemplation is really important to bring into a collective exercise,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
avoid it being too impulsive or projective, or to make that spacious, when oftentimes collective social interactions can be quite hyperventilating,
Mhm.
right? And it takes a certain inward spaciousness, I think, to make a communal exercise spacious.
Totally. So this is one of the things I would say, one of the things that dialectic and the dialogos encircling this experience that we're talking about is, in some senses, this, I mean, it is practicing doing that over and over and over again.
I think so. I
Yeah.
think it is.
Yeah.
I think it is. And there are there's a way in which it tries to trace both of those dimensions. I mean, it's more on the communal side, I would say, although especially with the Neoplatonic contemplation and the meditation as features of that workshop, there is an inwardness, there's an inward dimension to it as well, which is then ported into the communal one. And I also think that there are very different experiences afforded based on whether someone steps into it for the first time or for the second or third or fourth or fifth.
Yeah.
Because if it's all novel, then the novelty is a very significant feature of the experience, and the challenge of the novelty and the exposure and the newness of that exposure and the significance of getting to survey a whole bunch of practices that are perhaps not known to you. And the strangeness of that, some of them might appear strange to folks who have never done it before. You know, they would be certainly forgiven for that experience because there is a strangeness to a lot of these things because of how counterintuitive and counter-conventional sometimes they are. But conversely, because there is a structure built in, a rhythm, a certain cadence when you put all of these things together, sort of like watching a film or reading a book that you've already read or watched, the first experience is the wash of the novelty of the discovery of its unfolding, but then the subsequent experiences allow for a certain digestion of the pattern, a metabolizing of the pattern,
Yes.
and a facility with the pattern that actually allows it to do things that it couldn't do the first time out.
Yes.
So I think, and I suspect, because I've had this experience myself, that there are different experiences that attend to the different levels of experience that you could walk into this with. But I do think that even subsequent experiences offer, in the repetition and in the having acquired the rhythm and now getting to play it a little bit more expertly, provide something that the first experience also can't.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And this kind of this sense of fellowship, right? So to be open, if we say like, why philosophize? Why meditate? Why circle? Why do anything? Why do something that kind of brings all of them together, right? What's the and part of what we're saying here, or I think we're more exploring, is, and I think that's really important about this, is I think it's always going to be an exploration of why.
It's new every time in some ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's always a confrontation, anew, in some deep respect. And I think what we're talking about here is that, yeah, that there is a way, that it is possible to cultivate a way of being, right, such that what is most meaningful in the world and in life is that what you call you can be a more likely spot that the whole of that gets to show up.
Oh,
right.
Yeah. That's well put.
In some way.
That's well put. Wait, so let's say that again. The thing that you call you is more a spot, becomes a spot where the whole of you can show up.
Yeah.
Is that what you said?
The whole of it's more like I've been thinking. I think the thing I'm most present to in this conversation is this sense about that that way in which you could say that the world is pregnant with meaning, right? And yet it doesn't always give birth, right? Like that there's a big element to having a meaningful life, right? To experiencing just the factness of that I am at all, period, right? Before even any of the conditions of my whatness and what I am and what I'm doing, that to experience that is just as as a shining forth inexhaustible mystery, right? And to cultivate that and have that experience and have living have living be the process of both having that, but also becoming better at that in some. Um, and that there's the side of it that we're emphasizing in this conversation, which is, yeah, that there's a way that the world in some sense is looking for a place to birth itself, right? It's like who if I'm wine, who do I want to be? Who do I want to be pursued and consumed by? Right? Do I want like the one that's been paying attention for wine all his life, right? Such that all of me can, or you want to be tasted by Guy Sengstock, right? Who's has two distinctions about one.
Doesn't have his sommelier certificate yet.
Yeah, totally.
Although in many other ways he certainly does.
Yes, yes. And so there's this way where, in some sense, we could say that the circling dialogos is this element of where there are things to do, there's things to say, there are skills that you can proactively become better and better at in the proactive sense. And there's this other way, maybe that's even more deeper, that there's in some sense, there's like you're a site, right? You're a site, right? Something like a deep conversation that you couldn't have planned on, right? You couldn't have known that you wanted, but like that you could be that occasion, that there's something about you, right? That like your way of being seems to foster, like if somebody sat next to you on the airplane, the range of possibilities that become likely, right, with you. I think speak to this kind of cultivation of cultivation of capacities and ways of listening and attitudes and all the things that like one cultivates into doing all of these practices, that in some sense that is a way of being, and it can be cultivated, right? Like we can really do that. And such that the uncanny phenomenological stitching of life, right? It becomes something more and more a place that we notice and we can live into and participate in and encourage. And that when I asked you about this, like, is that cult? Can you do that? Can you develop that? And you said, I really hope so. And then when you said is like, it seems to be, if it is, fellowship, the shared wonderment is crucial with it. And I thought about this too, because I mean, when I was I think it was at Charleston, North Carolina. It's like I think it's Charleston. It's
South Carolina.
Yeah, South. Yeah. Sure.
Great town.
Totally, and because it's very much preserved, like consciously preserved in the way that it was.
Yeah.
1600s or something, and so it's an old city for Americas. But when you look, one of the things that the captain of the ship pointed out, he's like, if you look at what's the tallest points of the city, and they were all crosses, right? Now that like and because the zoning is in such a way that they want to preserve it as a historical landmark, so you really saw kind of like what it was like back then.
Yep.
And I've been thinking about that ever since, of that you know, in some way, what was cool about that is what's most important, like is constantly it's in the architecture. When you look up, the highest point that you look up is the thing that's most important, and everything's kind of organized in relationship to that.
Yep.
And then all of the, like the city in some sense could be like a living symbol, right, continually gathering that, right.
Totally, totally beautiful. Well, I mean, and there are other places like that too. I mean, Rome's like that, right? They don't. I believe they can't build and haven't,
Yeah.
or almost nothing higher than St. Peter's Basilica, right? And and the preservation of that hierarchy of meaning is a profoundly inspiring thing, even with the sense of irony of how much the orientation has changed at the street level. But the preserved memory of that hierarchy is still deeply, deeply stirring, even if it is only a memory. And we've been talking so much about memory that there's a great deal of pregnancy simply about that.
Yeah, yeah, totally, totally. So in one sense, the memory is, when religion, right, when religion was where it was at for us, right, and uh, at some level, the very structure of reality, right, was, you took one step and you're already in this conversation at some level.
Yeah.
Now it's not. That's not the case
No.
in a big way, but it's still like it's still important, but it's this thing that I think that we have to take up as individuals, right? We have to actually cultivate it, and 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 in some sense find ourselves, like, dwelling in a fellowship that are cultivating these questions, living in these questions.
That's right.
It's really like we have to do that ourselves. We really have to do that. It's not like and it's what's strange is it's optional, but it shouldn't be optional, right?
No, it's not optional.
Yeah.
It's really not, because I think we live out the consequences of not doing it all the time.
Yeah.
It's not it's not um it's not compulsory by convention. It's compulsory by, I don't know. It's a psychic necessity, right? It's like if we don't do it, something goes unrealized, undigested. Well, it's the examined life. It's the most famous Socratic maxim, right? And if it goes unexamined, if it goes unquestioned, then it's not as though some idea that should be considered is never considered, right? Obviously, that's not it. It's not the idea. It's the lived.
Yeah.
Oh, it's like the lived relationship is the question, right? It's the stance, it's the posture, it's the disposition before the world. That's the question. It's not the question, it's the question that's lived. Like Plato says in the Republic that everyone should study. This is so neat. He says in the Republic that everyone should study astronomy. And in the passage where I think it's I was just in a little reading group the other day. We were talking about, I think it's book 8, The Republic, and he talks about all of these different activities that take place in the polis and their roles and what they do and what their function, and everyone should study astronomy not simply or even primarily. I think I take this to mean, I might be wrong about this, but the way I understand this is that everyone should study astronomy not to develop the facility with the various measurements of astronomy and its various features of knowledge, but because the exercise of studying astronomy requires us to lift our gaze to the heavens.
Yes.
It is the formal necessity.
Yes.
It is the formal imperative, the formal exercise of lifting our attention.
Right.
That is the very value of the study of astronomy.
Yes. Yes.
Right.
All the necessities that it evokes, that those
Right.
that have one demonstrate capacities in yourself that end up becoming the most important things cross context that come
Even if they are the things that seem incidental
Yes.
because they're put in service of an end that is, let's say, acquiring knowledge of the finer points of, you know, of astronomy in an encyclopedic sense. But really, the point is the orientation of attention.
Yes. That orientation. Totally.
Right.
Totally.
And it's the same thing in the dialectic. The dialectic, like wherever you arrive about a virtue at the end of a dialectic, it's like, great. If you have a fantastic insight and you come up with some great ways of phrasing things, that's all well and good. But ultimately, I would say it's almost epiphenomenal. It's not the point.
Right.
And the thing that seems to shine with beauty in the moment of its utterance will fade from beauty a few days later if you're paying only attention to the language.
Yes. Yeah.
It's the resonance of the experience and the way of it's the metanoetic reorientation of attention that is the point of the practice. And that's the thing that lives on beyond the close of the practice itself. It's not the proposal that you arrive at the end, if you do arrive at any.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Such that when you're sitting on the stoop, right, and the neighbor just happens to sit next to you, right? There's a way that you can what lights up to you as something that you can see and you can choose to draw out and ask questions about and distinguish, right? Like that the things that you couldn't have known that you didn't know to want, and you couldn't have expected, right? Can start to be revealed. And like, in other words, you can be ready for that conversation that like could end up being the most important conversation of your life that you couldn't have ever have planned for. It's that, exactly. that orientation, right? That these practices, I think, really hone in on in a big way.
They do indeed.
Yeah.
Well put. I think that's a good place for us to rest.
Yeah. This is a really really rich. This is a rich one.
It was even more than I expected. Although that's foolish of me because I should always expect it when I talk to you.
Yes, yes, my friend.
So October 21st, 22nd, I believe, are our dates for the workshop.
October 21st and 22nd.
We'll have a link in the notes to the registration.
And I believe that there's something like there's benefits to registering early, I believe.
Yeah, there's an early bird period. I think we're still in it now.
Okay. Okay, sweet. I'll do a little intro to the video, and I'll put all the logistics at the front end of this too, so people can have that, and everything else will be in the show notes in terms of how to contact us and how to register and all of that.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thank you, sir.
All right, my friend. Bye.
Bye.